And today we're going to discuss the question of globalization, and we framed it as globalization in transition. So the topic of globalization has been around for many, many years. However, today, facing very rapid geopolitical shifts, we will be speaking of globalization in transition. What has been very consistent is China being at the core, at the heart of the debate about globalization. Today we have three speakers joining us today, yeah? And we have a special commentator whom I will introduce a little bit later. So let me introduce our speakers in more detail. We are very glad to have Stephen Davids, Professor of Political Science at the Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of many publications and books, and some outstanding works are Catastrophic Consequences, Civil Wars and American Interests, also Choosing Sides, Alignments and Realignments in the Third World. And today, Professor Davids will be giving his talk titled China's Appeal to Populist Leaders, A Friend in Need is a Friend Indeed. We also have Dr. Jinghan Zheng joining us today. He is Professor of China and International Studies at Lancaster University. He is the author of several books, including Artificial Intelligence with Chinese Characteristics, National Strategy, Security and Authoritarian Governance, published in 2022. And another outstanding work that is one of those that I appreciate a lot, Slogan Politics, Understanding Chinese Foreign Policy Concepts. Professor Zhang will be speaking about Belt and Road Initiative today. And we also have Humphrey Hawksley, who is the BBC foreign correspondent, commentator, and broadcaster. He is the author of Dragon Strike, Dragon Fire, and the Third World War. Well, as I just said, special commentator Benjamin Ho, who will be joining us later, I will introduce shortly after the presentations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Davids.
Thank you, Anna. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to discuss China's appeal to populist leaders and why this matters in terms of the competition between China and America for influence throughout the world. I think it's clear to everyone that America and China are engaged in a global competition to attract influence among leaders throughout the world. Some of these leaders are populists, who make up around 40 of the world's leaders, and by some calculations, rule over 1.7 billion people. And the opportunity to rule over many more, especially if in the United States, a populist leader is elected in November. In this competition for influence among populist leaders, I'm arguing that China has several advantages. And for those concerned about American and Western interests in containing China, it's worth considering these advantages and seeing what can be done to respond to them. My talk will unfold as follows. I will first talk about the interests of populist leaders, what causes them to align the ways they do. And here I'm going to reference the theory of omnibalancing, which I introduced some years ago, explaining why many leaders choose the patrons they do. Then I'm going to talk about why China, in many ways, is better poised to attract the alignment of populist leaders than the US or the West. And then I'm going to discuss how America and the West can respond to the Chinese challenge and make the argument that why accepting the loss of Western influence in the short term regarding attracting populist leaders might be the best way to go. Better to sacrifice some short-term gains in attracting the allegiance of populist leaders than going all out to try and gain their alignment, thus betraying American and Western values. So let me first begin with the notion that in order to understand why populist leaders may turn to China, it's first necessary to understand what the interests of these leaders are. To this, again, I turn to the theory of omnibalancing. I mean, omnibalancing was developed as a correction to traditional balance of power theory. In traditional balance of power theory, states, heads of state, pursue the national interest, which often means protecting their countries from external threats, from invasions, from war, from efforts at conquest. Omnibalancing differs from the balance of power approach in several ways. First, omnibalancing argues that it's not so much the national interest that drives the way leaders behave, but rather their own personal interest. What they're interested in doing is satisfying their needs, not the needs of their country. And the most important personal interest these leaders have is remaining in power, in part because power gives them access to wealth and prestige, but also for many leaders, and this includes many populist leaders, if you are removed from power, the consequences could be very dire. They could be imprisonment or even death. So these leaders are laser focused on which outside country is best poised, which outside country has the willingness and capability to keep me in power. Moreover, omnibalancing agrees with balance of power that countering threats is critical in determining alignment, but it differs from traditional balance of power in arguing that the threats that matter most are not so much threats to the state as a whole, but threats to the leadership's hold on power. So while balance of power focuses on threats from other states, omnibalancing focuses on domestic threats. It does this because the most pressing threats to leaders, especially populist leaders, come not from outside states launching invasion, but from domestic concerns, mass protests, coups, insurgencies, assassinations. So if omnibalancing is correct in choosing between China and America, populist leaders will turn to the superpower, the great power, most likely to protect them from the threats they face, which most likely will be domestic threats. And I argue that more and more China seems to be the choice for these leaders, that China is best poised to protect these leaders from the most pressing threats, which traditionally are domestic threats they face. Now, why is China poised to do this? How can China protect these leaders from domestic threats? Well, again, China has certain advantages in doing so. One is the export of digital technology that the Chinese have perfected at home that watches over everyone, everywhere, all the time. China has supplied to regimes throughout the world, including the regimes of populist leaders, technology for facial recognition, monitoring of social media, the collection of data, censorship, and surveillance. This enables the regimes to control what their citizens see, check for any signs of dissent, learn about efforts at protests or insurrections, and quash any challenges to the regime before they can pick up steam. Statistical research demonstrates that leaders who employ these digital technologies face fewer protests and other threats to their rule than those who do not. And again, this is especially important in the arena of mass protests, which have emerged as the leading cause of forcible regime change in the past decade. These same technologies enable leaders to also monitor potential elite challenges that might provoke a coup, which many of these leaders also fear. Artificial intelligence supercharges these digital technologies, which enables a relatively small number of people in one's country to monitor the entire population. Very different during the Cold, as was the case during the Cold War, when, for example, the Stasi intelligence apparatus in East Germany employed millions of people to watch over the population. Now you can watch over the population, censor what they see, uh, control their political preferences with far fewer individuals. And let me just say a word about controlling political preferences. There's a debate going on in America today about TikTok, a Chinese-owned app that roughly 170 million Americans use. I mean, there are two concerns about TikTok, which are relevant here. One is that they can monitor the location and preferences of the individuals who use them. And the other is that they can shape political preferences, be it on the Middle East, who you're going to vote for, and so on. To the extent to which China can perfect these technologies, it will enable leaders who use them to better keep their hold on power. I mean, America also exports some digital surveillance, but nowhere near to the extent that China does. It's typically done in America and in the West through private companies that are subject to constraints, certainly in the US through the State Department. So if you're a populist leader looking to control your population, China is certainly the preferred partner. I mean, aside from providing tools for digital surveillance, there are other ways that China is the preferred patron for many populist leaders. Unlike the West, China does not care whether a leadership is corrupt, autocratic, or treats its citizens badly. Populist leaders worried that outside interference will undermine their ability to rule need not be worried about China. This is especially true for issues that populist leaders are likely to be most concerned about. One of these is immigration. Probably the key issue that propels populist leaders to power is controlling immigration. Populist leaders will often seek to close borders, deport migrants, demonize immigrants. China will not care. China is a country that has virtually no immigration of its own. America and the West may object to some harsh measures to control migrant flows. Again, will not be the case with China. China is also likely to promote economic growth in many of these countries, at least in the short term. China is the #1 trading partner of most of the world's countries, which could help in enhancing their economic growth. China's aid and trade deals with often with political influence in mind. China provides attractive terms, good prices, and China is especially valuable in providing showy infrastructure projects, which populist leaders can point to as a sign that they're doing a good job. And China also reinforces the image of a powerful leader. Populist leaders, almost by definition, have autocratic tendencies. Liberal democracies shun and criticize them, but China, as a fellow autocrat, will welcome them within the Chinese sphere of influence. So China has significant advantages in attracting populist leaders to their sphere of influence. Now, there are some problems that China also has. Many of these countries get into debt. China pursues shady labor practices. It destroys indigenous businesses, sometimes destroys the environment. Its workers engage sometimes in racist behavior. But overall, if you're a populist leader seeking to survive in power, which I would argue is their #1 concern, China is going to be the preferred patron. The question then that follows, why Chinese leaders would seek to attract the allegiance of populist leaders. Let me just quickly go over a few points why China would be engaged in this struggle for influence. And like all great powers, China seeks a world congenial to its interests and values. And this means overturning America's liberal international order, with its emphasis on democracy, free markets, and international institutions. Populist leaders are likely to be a supporter of China's efforts to overturn the liberal international order, since it's a direct threat to them. If China seeks to replace the American liberal international order, populist leaders will play a central role in doing so. Moreover, China seeks to gain footholds in countries, especially countries along its periphery. China is concerned that America will seek to gain influence with countries that border China or near China to promote splitism, that is, supporting secessionist movements in China. So if China can control its periphery, keep the West out, keep America out, it will be advancing Chinese interests. Populist leaders' allegiance are also often up for grabs. They are not firmly in either group, either the West group or the China group, whether we're talking about South Africa, El Salvador, Hungary, India. These are leaders whose allegiance can be bid for, and making them a prime source of competition between America and China. All of these leaders have made some noises indicating that they might move towards China. Even in Israel, Bibi Netanyahu was flirting with the notion that China might replace America as its patron. At least he did so before October 7th. So you've got a series of leaders, a group of leaders whose allegiance is up for grabs that China will seek to enlist. And in broader terms, China wants to extend its sway over populist leaders as part of its campaign for national rejuvenation. The legitimacy of the Chinese regime is based in large measure that China will redress the century of humiliations it faced from 1839 to 1949, and China will step up and achieve what it sees its rightful place in the world order. Doing so means extending its influence, and as I've indicated, populist leaders are a likely candidate for doing so. Very quickly, how can America respond to Chinese efforts to secure the allegiance of populist leaders? And there are essentially two basic approaches. One is that America can compete with China on its own terms. That China exports digital technologies, America can do so as well. That China ignores corruption and repressive policies, America could also turn a blind eye to these efforts. In essence here, America can try and out-China China itself. My sense is this approach is unlikely to work. Pursuing a policy that is inconsistent with American values is unlikely to be supported or sustained for long in the United States. And leaders having to choose between an autocratic China versus an America trying to be autocratic are likely to opt for the real thing and turn to China. One major caveat: if Trump is elected president in the United States, then I think America's appeal to populist leaders will grow, because you will have a fellow populist in the White House. So if one is simply looking at trying to attract the allegiance of populist leaders, electing President Trump might be a good idea. Another approach for the US is to remain true to its liberal democratic values and accept the cost this would incur in attracting populist leaders. In other words, say to the populist leaders, we do not support you, at least your extreme policies, and we will do what we can to support opponents to you, to either moderate those policies or to support alternatives to your rule. These moves will clearly drive populist leaders away from the United States. And in the competition to gain the support of populist leaders with China, America would lose. But if the US loses in the short term, the hope would be that in the long term, hostility to populism would win out. And those populations who saw the United States as not supporting the leaders who pursued policies that were repressive and harmful to the interests of the people will over time turn to the United States. And there's already some evidence of an anti-populism wave in the world. The Tony Blair Institute reported in 2023 that the number of populist leaders has fallen to a 20-year low, with the number of people living under populist rule falling by 800 million in 2 years. Populist leaders in Brazil, Slovenia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Poland, all have been removed, and that the world has gone from 2.5 billion people living under populist rule in 2020 to 1.7 billion people in 2023. So we have a situation where populism may be on the wane, and for America to simply try and cater to populist demands would be a short-term effort that is likely to be like a rat joining a sinking ship. To conclude, I would argue the following is clear. Populism remains a major force in world politics, and populist leaders have a special incentive to turn to leaders who have the will and capacity to keep them in power. That China is better positioned to meet this need than is the United States. That America would likely fail if it attempted to mimic China's efforts to pursue policies that keep populist leaders in office. But by standing true to its values, the US holds out the hope of winning the long game with China. This is especially the case given the decline of populism in recent years. All this changes, however, if Trump wins the presidency. With a fellow populist in charge, the US stands to make more friends among the cohort of populist leaders, but it does so only at the cost of abandoning its principles, leaving itself open to the blowback that would erode America's position in the world while dramatically improving the position of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Davids. We will have discussion in the end of the session, yes, and I'm really looking forward to I already see the hands, raising hands, but we have to keep it to the discussion Q&A section, okay? So now, we'll move to the topic of Belt and Road Initiative that is central to China's foreign policy making. Professor Zhang, please.
Thank you, and thank you for having me in this conference, and really hear a lot of insights which are very beneficial. I think the story I am going to talk about will be based on a very different angle. I'm going to talk about a Belt and Road Initiative from a China expert which is based in Europe. And I think hearing the previous discussions, I think probably there are several things, 4 things I want to lay out, and 4 different kind of angles I want to lay out before I tell my story. First of all, I understand that in the US, very much a lot of people see the Belt and Road and also China's foreign policy from a geopolitical competition point of view, which is a state against state kind of game, this is largely true. But I think, and also there is also often make a distinction between the Chinese state, authoritarian state, and the US democratic states. But what the story I'm going to tell you probably is you are going to find more similarities between the system than differences. And second point I want to make here is following the previous discussion on populist leaders, I understand the general understanding is that since 2012, China has become more centralized and leader has become more authoritarian. But this is the story I'm going to tell about Belt and Road Initiative. I actually tell you how decentralized China is and how people have different views and the diversity of it, and all happening under Xi Jinping's rule. And this leads to the third angle, third point I'm making here is in international relation literature, when we look at China, we tend to view China as a unilateral actor. And that's how a lot of analysis understand China. China wants to do this, China wants to do that. But what I'm going to tell you later is trying to unpack this black box and tell you the different political actors within China, how they want very different things. And this ultimately has been shaping the outcome of Chinese foreign policy. And then this leads to the fourth point I want to make here is sometimes there is a big difference between the general vision of what China wants to become and the actual policy and reality of political economy in China. So when we say China wants to use Belt and Road Initiative to reshape the global order, but actually if you unpack China, you'll find very different actors within China want very different things. And many of them don't really care about geopolitical orders. So those will be the kind of highlights I want to give you before I start it. I do have a PowerPoint, and if I can share it here, right? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Right. So I'll be briefly talking about Belt and Road. I think to link with the panel topic, Belt and Road Initiative has been widely discussed as China's vision for globalization. You know, it's a Chinese version of how globalization should be. If you trace back the history, obviously in the history of Silk Road, Ming has been talking about the traditional Silk Road of how this was a link trade route linked China with the rest of the world, and that's where it comes from, and what this is going to be in the future. And to skip, to very quickly jump into the contemporary discussion, there are two interpretations about China's Belt and Road Initiative currently. The one is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a geopolitical and grand strategy of China, which is very top-down to reflect Beijing's view to reshape the global order, to deliver a China-centric world order, to undermine American power in the region and globally. However, the other side of the story, which is I'm going to tell you today, is more of a bottom-up angle of the Belt and Road Initiative and China's major foreign policy. And I argue that actually Belt and Road Initiative is a political slogan which is open for interpretation and subject to change. So just to go back to literature a little bit, I think for many international commentators, especially many in the US actually, the Belt and Road Initiative has led to a sizable literature talking about how this is a well thought out Chinese grand strategy, how this is China going to claim its geopolitical dominance in Asia, how this is China going to challenge American dominance, create a Chinese-centered world order, or even Chinese Marshall Plan, if not more ambitions. And then when we talk about the purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative, the literature generally argue that this is Chinese attempt to seek nothing more than rewriting the current geopolitical landscape, or China is after the world dominance. So you can very much summarize the current kind of mainstream argument, consider the Belt and Road as a well-designed, clearly defined, top-down geopolitical and grand strategy of Beijing to projecting China's geopolitical ambitions. And I am actually going to argue that this view is probably mistaken, and I'm making several points on why this view is mistaken. First of all, is although there is some general broad vision that to uplift China's role in the world, to make China great again, but if you really look deep into the Belt and Road Initiative, you don't really find a coherence and consistency within what China wants to achieve through the Belt and Road Initiative. If you go back to 2012, for example, when the Belt and Road Initiative was represents Xi Jinping's new vision for China and for Chinese foreign policy introduced 2013 to 2014 to 2015. Every year, you can see a big significant change in terms of geographical focus of this Belt and Road Initiative and the precise plan of this Belt and Road Initiative. And also, if you compare the second Belt and Road Initiative forum and the first Belt and Road Initiative forum, you'll find a very different kind of focus, very different kind of narrative China want to put forward. So essentially, what we're saying is not a well-designed, predefined strategy. What we have seen here is an evolving idea with a big kind of slogan announced first, without any concrete plan being announced at the time, and then its policy, action, and substance has been evolving year by year, even until now to 2024. So this is why I think the Belt and Road Initiative is actually shifting, and in Chinese they call 3ING, means it's planning, developing, and implementing at the same time. So if you really say from a grand strategy point of view, it's something long-term with clearly defined goals. This doesn't really fit. And also, even until now, there wasn't really an official certified list of countries involved. What we have seen here is different kind of media circulation of official map, but there wasn't one single map that is but given by Chinese government saying those are the countries in BRI countries, those are not. And also in terms of the theme of the project, again, there is no one single list to let you know what is BRI project, what isn't. And also regarding the overall amount of funding about BRI, which is often being used by many strategists to say, BRI is coming, it's something over 1 trillion, or those kind of number, again, depends on how you actually calculate different projects add together. And if you consider all the Chinese foreign policy project, the number can be very high. But again, I think this goes back to the first question, because there isn't a one single list of project that is Belt and Road, that isn't. So it's very difficult to really say the overall amount of funding involved in the Belt and Road initiative, and what is a BRI project, what isn't, and how they will be serving Chinese foreign policy objective, generally speaking. So that is a consistent part. And the second point is about coherence. And usually when we look into Chinese foreign policy, I think a lot of international analysts would say, China, because it's also authoritarian regime, it's very much top-down. The Beijing government can mobilize lots of resources to achieve one single geopolitical objective. However, this has very much ignored the domestic dynamics of China. And if you look into Belt and Road, many argue this is nationally concerted effort to achieve something. But what I am going to show you later, it's the opposite, is how domestic actor has been competing for resources in China. This involves state-owned enterprises, provincial governments, private sectors. They all have their own interpretation of BRI, their own agenda they want to advance, rather than one single coherent nationally concerted effort. So one very clear example of that is how different provincial units has been acting to it, right? Usually you assume one belt, one road, but actually the actual practice is many belts, many roads. Out of 34 provincial units, you got a few provinces claim they are starting points, dozens of provinces claim they are the bridgeheads, dozens of provinces claim they are the center. So ultimately what you are seeing is all provinces are seeing they are the most important, or probably one of the most important part of Belt and Road Initiative, and thus deserves more kind of funding resources. And what we have really been showing here is the Chinese style of federalism, goes back to 1980s. And also there are, for example, when you come to the Silk Road economic belt, you've got 3 cities, Chongqing, Xi'an, and Luoyang. All of them claim they are the starting point of the Silk Road economic belt. I am from Chongqing, so when I make a presentation in Chongqing, I'll be very careful about this, not saying Xi'an or Luoyang is a starting point. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble. It's the same when I make a presentation in Shanxi, in Xi'an. They think Xi'an is actually the Silk Road economic belt, right? So same in Luoyang as well. And when it comes to the Maritime Silk Road, you got China's Fujian province, Zhejiang province, Guangdong province. They all have their city claim they are the starting point of the Silk Roads. And also you got a lot of new concepts being created, like the T starting points, southern starting points, or northern starting points, in which Shandong province and Hebei province, Qingdao and Huanghua, they are fighting for who is the northern starting point here. And so the point I'm making here is, rather than one single coherent kind of picture to advance national interests, you do see considerable amount and high level of competition within domestic Chinese province. And one clear example is a competition between Chongqing and Chengdu. So the competition between Chongqing and Chengdu can go back to decades ago and has always been there and has never disappeared. So the Belt and Road Initiative is one example of that structural competition come to current context. So the story is very simple here is Chongqing firstly initiated the Chongqing to Xinjiang to Europe railway, which you can go see the picture on the right is going through Chongqing is a starting point, going to Xi'an, Lanzhou, and then to Europe. And this railway does not pass the other city, Chengdu. However, very quickly, Chengdu launched its own version of the railway, which on the left, which you can say the starting from Chengdu to go through the Middle East, so to go through Europe. So you can say two kind of railway rather than working with each other or coordinated with each other, you see the heavy amount of competition there. It's the same for Zhengzhou to Europe blockchain as well. Essentially, all those cities were competing rather than collaborating on one single coherent goals. And another story will be the case of Jiangsu, which is a very interesting case study that one of my paper looked into. I think basically, because of time, I wouldn't be going details into it. If you're interested, you can take a look of the article. But I think the basic story is saying how Jiangsu had a very high expectation on its role being recognized by Beijing as a key point of the BRI, and then Beijing failed to deliver that expectation, and Jiangsu go its own way to claim it's still how Jiangsu ignored the guidance from a key central agency in Beijing, continue to claim it's a key point of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's another example of how local central relation is complicated rather than a top-down relation. So what does this mean? I think if you go back to the original consideration of Belt and Road, yes, there are a lot of geopolitical considerations. For example, in Obama's time, there was TPP was there, China trying to secure trade routes, avoid TPP area, go to the west side, and also to provide alternative international market for Chinese companies to address regional equality between western and eastern part of China. However, this geopolitical context changed very quickly. In the US, Trump comes in, TPP is no longer there, things changed a lot. So is Chinese plans. And now the Belt and Road Initiative is really a strategic signal to show in China's growing role in the world. And it has become a catch-all slogan, including China's external activities. So when we say we are trying to counter TPP, what actually we are saying is not countering a specific concrete geopolitical strategy. These are going to counter a slogan. And that might create some problems and confusion there. So what is the direction of travel in the future? And clearly, Belt and Road Initiative is very different now after pandemic. Yes, last year was BRI 10. I think we can see that the critical difference of the infrastructure in the BRI has now been significantly downplayed. And also the idea, I think, of China's growing global status is also very different from when the BRI was introduced. But it does achieve the goal to show China's importance in the world. And also the Belt and Road Initiative now has been a lot more focused on developing countries and provide alternative market for Chinese company and alternative fundings for the host country. So that's what the BRI has achieved for now. But if you look at the Belt and Road in the next 10 years' time, clearly, I think Xi Jinping has made it very clear the BRI will become something small and beautiful. So it's a very different kind of Belt and Road Initiative as we originally understand it back in 2013. This is why I argue this is a slogan, which means that does not really have a clear geopolitical strategy and is subject to change and open for interpretation. So to conclude, and some takeaway message. So what this means, right? What this means. I think that there are 4 points I want to make here. First of all, the Chinese government and China is not a unilateral actor. There are many actors in China, many government actors in China, and sometimes they agree with each other, sometimes they don't, just like the American system. And even within the central government in Beijing, different ministries, they have different interests, different agenda. Not everything is necessarily being coordinated. So when we talk about China wants this, China wants that, we have to bear in mind there's no one single coherent Chinese view on certain things. And a lot of things probably is not a result of one single unit. This is why I'm saying at the very beginning, I think we often ignore the seminality of that federalism here, or federalism with Chinese characteristics. The second point is there a coherent vision for globalization in China? Because there are so many different actors in China, they have different views on what globalization means, what a globalized world means. And that vision are not necessarily reflected in concrete Chinese policy to deliver that. So we have to take into the factor of the slogan. We often talk about, yes, China have a plan to become the world #1. China has a plan to make China great again. Yes, that is true, but that's very similar like Trump's plan to say make America great again, but does not necessarily mean Trump has a very clear idea and a few steps to how to deliver that blueprint, right? So are we exaggerating a little bit of the Chinese threat here? I think that's a question probably for the panel. And the third point, and also a very important point I want to make here, is when we're trying to understand Chinese foreign policy, if you're following that logic that is top-down unilateral actor, you often assume every single Chinese foreign policy comes from a purpose. There must be some geopolitical objectives under it, and there must be something, dedicated and carefully crafted. But actually, if you're seeing from this bureaucratic political the struggle among different foreign ministries, different Chinese provinces, you realize that the reason why we often see the contradictory Chinese policy is because of that political power struggle among different actors in China. And that is what has been shaping Chinese foreign policy outcome, not one single coherent objective, not necessarily with some intention or geopolitical intention. It's purely bureaucracy, how different political actors come together, aggregation of their interests. The outcome of that power struggle among the political actors, state actors, and private actors even, has been shaping Chinese foreign policy. And we really have to understand and unpack China as a black box in order to understand why certain policies are being developed, what they are really for. And this comes to the fourth argument as well. I think it's understandably easy to say when you want to mobilize some resources in European or in the US, there is often a very convenient others to use. And China has often served as the convenient others who has been doing great here, who has been doing great there in terms of AI, in terms of the foreign policy, and using as an example of how more resources should be justified into the case, which makes sense from a kind of lobbying point of view and from a political system point of view. But I think as academics, our job is to really unpack those narratives and trying to say what political narrative reflects the reality of China, what political narrative fail to do that or probably is mistaken. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I would like to welcome comments, questions, and very much looking forward to joining discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Thank you very much for reminding us how complex Chinese politics is, and we'll discuss more in the discussion session. Yeah. Now I suggest we move to the third speaker, Mr. Huxley. I was wondering if you could provide more information to us about your concepts of next generation globalization. I think you are muted. Can you? Yeah. Yeah.
Am I unmuted now? Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Anna, for that. Can you all hear me now? Thank you for my two fellow panelists. I found myself waving towards one and the other, not quite sure where I land. So I'm going to try to drill that out. It's a privilege to be asked here today because it's an unfamiliar role that you've given me here, Anna, in that journalists often get when talking to power brokers and government officials who are unwilling to reveal information that we should not speculate and we do not have a crystal ball. But you have asked me to predict the next generation of globalization under China, multipolarity and authoritarian populism. So should you ask me back 10 or 15 years from now, there will be ample opportunity for everybody to tear my predictions apart, but nevertheless, I'm going to give it a shot. My initial reaction to the title of my presentation was that each word had too many syllables for a busy person doing their work around the world to get to grips with. We have in my trade, I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist, to get our message to the widest possible audience, that we dumb it down and we speed it up. We are dealing here with the phraseology of the elite. And if viewing this from a perch in Asia or the Indo-Pacific, as the region is now strategically defined, each of those words is highly subjective. Globalization, multipolarity, authoritarianism, and of course, populism. Whoever you talk to will have a different definition of them, but in short, they encapsulate how China and much of the global South views the contradictions and inconsistencies within the argument of Western democracies about the international rule of law and the world order. Now, those examples, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, from human rights to sovereignty, focuses on that perception that a rising China is a threat to our values and way of life. And we've heard that from my two previous speakers there. But I'm going to take you through where I think things stand at the moment. And I think it's quite good to anchor that in the slate of recent elections that there's been in the Indo-Pacific: Pakistan, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines a couple of years ago, India's upcoming result, foretold, we presume, and they tell us about the pragmatic mindset of this region that is very much in China's arc of influence. And I'd first like to ground that mindset. These multi-syllable words that I mentioned, they originate in academia and think tanks of Western democracies. The values and the glue of Europe and North America, who created and are the current controllers of the world order. Now, the Indo-Pacific comprises some 50 nations, depending how you want to measure it, of which only 5 are developed democracies. 2 of those are Australia and New Zealand, essentially European satellites. The others, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, not technically a nation, are strongly mentored American protégés with an East Asian work ethic, and they're born out of war or facing the threat of further war. The others are a tapestry of values and systems: military, oligarchs, creaking communism, modern communism, sultanates, authoritarianism, all having to live, work, jostle together, hopefully without too many shots being fired from anger. They cannot use the sort of high-minded ideological phrases like democracy and freedom and human rights to get their day-to-day needs across the line. It just won't work. In 2019, I was in Indonesia when the Hong Kong democracy protests were in full flow, and I asked an old friend who was once an anti-Suharto protester from the late 1990s why there was so little support for Hong Kong in Southeast Asia. He rolled his eyes at my naivety. "Humphrey," he said, "those Hong Kong people don't know how good they've had it for so long. They're dealing with the sort of jackboot crap and corruption that we have to duck and weave around every day. Welcome to my part of the world." Now, Hong Kong, as I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, they actually ramped up the security law that they've got there. Hong Kong did once have a populist leader in the form of the late Governor Chris Patten. I was the BBC correspondent there at the time, and I got to know Chris well, and I like him a lot. Populism as a concept hadn't yet percolated in its modern incarnation. I know it goes back some way. But in order to satisfy the dreams, ambitions of the British Parliament and the British electorate, he arrived 5 days before China took over and tried to rewrite agreements so that Hong Kong had a higher level of democracy. It would be nothing like we enjoyed in the West, and it came years after democracy campaigners in Hong Kong had been shunted to one side by the British colonial government that said democracy was not suitable for Hong Kong. This was a leader satisfying his domestic demands at home. Now, those reforms played well in Britain and Hong Kong at the grassroots. The people believed that Britain and the international community would face down China, ensure their rights. But it didn't happen. China came in, it shut down the Legislative Council for a year, it held new elections under Chinese characteristics, it crushed protests, arrested ringleaders, and brought in very tough security laws. Now, that might be wrong, that might be immoral. It might breach international law as viewed from the West, but in China's view, it was needed to ensure stability, and it happened, and those on the ground that have to live with that, live with the consequences of broken populist dreams. Just as those in Iraq and elsewhere are living with far worse than the Hong Kong experiment, or in Britain, if I might say, we're living with less worse, but with the consequences of Brexit engineered by populist politicians here. We heard from Stephen David about the possibility of Trump coming in. We've had the same problems here and a number of countries in Europe. Now, those examples I've cited are anchored in Western interventions and our so-called democratic values. I argue that the Indo-Pacific is not yet at the stage of development where it accepts as a region the values which we live by, and it believes it cannot afford to accept them. Now, I was discussing populist leaders recently. Is Narendra Modi a populist? Is Xi Jinping? What about Duterte or now Marcos or Imran Khan in Pakistan? One weathered diplomat in a group that I had said that populism is when the bad guys win elections, the bad guys being those who challenge the playbook of Western thinking. Now, the Indo-Pacific is challenging because, as I've argued, as a region, it is in an earlier stage of development with different needs. Western concepts of freedom originate from societies with strong institutions and infrastructure, basically where water runs from taps and light comes on at the flick of a switch. The warring European nations of the 1940s enjoyed such luxuries even before they started fighting, and those luxuries were built under largely non-democratic governments. Britain didn't have full democracy until 1929. We built a system that turned on the light bulbs under autocracy and developed freedoms of speech and association and so on under democracy. The concept of freedom in much of the Indo-Pacific and the global South revolves around getting water to the taps and electricity to the life bulb. Freedom is not only about speaking your mind, it's about securing food and shelter, which many of us in the West take for granted. The European concept has been too slow to understand the Asian one. Because we live and have a certain mindset now, we think everyone else should have that mindset too, and they should have it now. And this thinking led to the forever wars in the Middle East and North Africa, and debates like the one we're having today with my fellow panelists must, in my view, work hard to avoid that the same doesn't happen in the Indo-Pacific. And that brings me to China, which has set a world record, metaphorically speaking, in turning on light bulbs, whose wealth holds sway over the region, if not much of the world. And we've just heard how 10 years ago, the Belt and Road Infrastructure Building Initiative captured the world's imagination. And in 2017, the darling of the Western elite at Davos was Xi Jinping himself, who gave a compelling speech on global cooperation. Britain was at that stage in its golden era, if anybody remembers that, with China, which was going to build our railways and power stations, and our politicians ignored intelligence and think tank reports that China was what it was. And they began by describing it in the now derogatory terms, no golden era, this was a Marxist-Leninist state. And it's no coincidence that this international political debate moved to China as our wars in the Middle East were being seen as monumental failures. And it's no coincidence either that the Western financial military, and that with the Western financial military and development crises, with those wars and that, China became hubristic and saw weakness and thought it could rule the world. Nor is it a coincidence that the media's dumb it down and speed it up doctrine that I referred to recently have a new villain in the form of that autocratic populist Xi Jinping and a new flashpoint in the form of Taiwan. But as we just heard from my previous panelist, China might not have our style of elections, but it does have debate and argument. Does one province see the other as its enemy, or does it see Western values as its enemy? This is something that is happening, fierce debate with highly intelligent people taking part of it within China. Xi at the moment is being reined in by Communist Party elders, veterans of the Cultural Revolution, beneficiaries of the modernization of the non-populist Deng Xiaoping, with policies largely followed by his successors until now, which gave China the wealth and influence it has today. There's a critical mass, in my view, of people, powerful people within China that believe those policies should be continued, and Xi must be reined back in. China's biggest markets remain in Europe and North America. It is far from being able to continue to grow its wealth and develop its technology by solely trading with the global South. And to do what Russia has done, for example, would be suicide and should put a Taiwan invasion out of the question. Our media, dumb it down and speed it up, loves the Taiwan thing, but in my view, that's just not going to happen. I mean, the Taiwan invasion. China also has no experience in building complex alliances such as NATO and the European Union. It has no allies as such. Those it picks, such as, say, Cambodia, Russia, or North Korea, cannot deliver the high standards of living, which is the pact that the Communist Party has with the Chinese people. Its currency, its markets, its networks, its finance, the art of compromise and negotiation, China is a minnow. One day it will rule the world, I'm sure, but not in any of our lifetimes. As I said, there is a critical mass of highly intelligent elite in China who, in my view, will bring it back to the middle ground. We should not lecture. We should just let them get on with their jobs and do it. Which brings me to those other regional elections I mentioned. First, the results, and then I'll give you my one-line analysis. Let's go way across to Pakistan. A China ally or friend or whatever we want to call it lies at a sensitive crossroads encompassing Afghanistan, Iran, India, and China. Pakistan has been a failed or broken democracy for decades, with the military's writ destructively embedded in its institutions. Both Washington and Beijing have exploited this weakness. But at the recent elections, in their droves, Pakistani voters gave support to candidates backing a jailed underdog, the former ousted Prime Minister and ex-cricketer Imran Khan. They torpedoed the shady status quo between the military and those entrenched political dynasties. Khan's Movement for Justice Party was banned from actually standing, but candidates affiliated with him won the largest number of National Assembly seats. A message that smashed the myth that the military is the guardian of Pakistani nation, where not very bright generals continue to claim that they can run the country better than leaders held to account by the ballot box. Those people, those generals, have kept the country in a constant state of war with a crippled economy, and it is time they have backed off. That is the voters' message. Now, Khan supporters didn't get to form a government because they wouldn't have been able to work with those entrenched institutions, but they are a powerful voice that needs to be heeded for the country to move on. Indonesia, another huge, predominantly Muslim nation, the world's biggest, critical trade points between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The hugely popular Joko Widodo stepping down after serving 2 5-year terms, but there's been substantive backroom horse trading to make sure he keeps power and influence, and his son is on the vice presidential winning ticket. The defense minister, Prabowo Subianto, took a clear majority, pledging to continue infrastructure development. But Prabowo is a former general who used horrific violence to get his way during Indonesia's Cold War, so bad that he was subject to a visa ban by the US that was only lifted in 2019 when he became defense minister. Voters factored that in and still chose him. And then that resembles the Philippines, where in 2022, voters went for the son of the former President Ferdinand Marcos. We will remember his dictatorial repression is legendary, and in a similar compromise and horse trading, the daughter of his predecessor, that was Rodrigo Duterte, is Marcos's vice president. There's a trend here of voters ignoring leaders' bad moral records in favor of strongman reputations and a belief that these are the best candidates to get things done and reform systems, preferably from within. Another emerging trend is the popularity of Asia's democratically elected leaders compared to their colleagues in the West. Joko, Prabowo, Duterte, Marcos, they enjoy remarkable popularity ratings, and they're joined in South Asia by Narendra Modi and Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, who was easily returned to office. I don't know. My colleagues here on the panel have a better idea of that than me, but political trust is higher in the Indo-Pacific than it is in the West. There are some similarities here also to Taiwan's recent presidential election, where voters chose the governing party's policy to stand up to Chinese interference and bullying, but again, with compromise. They do not want to cross any line that risks pushing Beijing into any corner towards war. So Asia voters are opting for common sense. They're not going for pipe dreams. They want to work within systems, not trying to knock them down, but with leaders who've got a record of getting things done. And Asia's electoral vote is a far cry from the more uncompromising Western-backed attempts of a decade or so ago to embed democracy in the Middle East and North Africa without any preparation whatsoever. This embryonic evolution that's happening in the Indo-Pacific has got a chance of success. So looking to my crystal ball, I believe that Indo-Pacific pragmatism will prevail, that China will recover the middle ground and will continue to develop, whereby that natural pact between citizen and government will demand higher levels of accountability, as happened in Taiwan in the 1980s. I have no idea if that is democracy. Call it what you want, bearing in mind that Britain and China have the two biggest unelected chambers in parliaments around the world. We are a democracy, and China is accused of being a dictatorship. I want to finish with a final vignette that I had, because when I was researching one of my recent nonfiction books called Asian Waters, I visited fishermen who were being challenged by China by taking their traditional fishing grounds off the coast of the Philippines. As an olive branch, China flew a delegation of them from a particular village to Beijing, showed them their modern fishing methods, and gave them a reception in the Great Hall of the People. In the shack house of one of them on a humid evening, with cards being played, basketball, motorbike sounds, and all around, I noticed on the wall of the delegation leader were photographs of the Statue of Liberty, the Brooklyn Bridge, and a poster from a Hollywood movie, and he was wearing a baseball cap. When do you think, I asked him, you're going to have pictures up there of Tiananmen Square and the Great Wall? He smiled at me, and he opened a drawer under his desk, and he built out exactly that, Tiananmen Square and the Great Wall, including a framed portrait of Xi Jinping. He also had a Mao cap, which he jokingly put on. He tapped the Xi Jinping photo and he said, not ready for this yet. These are more fun. And so is he. And he pointed to his Hollywood poster on the wall, and it was Clint Eastwood in a spaghetti Western. He said, give me the American dream anytime. Is that populist? I don't know. I have no idea. But it's a story, in my view, that sums up that when it comes to the hearts and minds of Asia, it is for China to win and for us to lose. But in my view, as my previous panelist said, it does not have to be hostile rivalry at all. It can be a win-win situation. And I do not believe that China is an existential threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoxley, and thank you for putting things into a broader comparative perspective for us and encouraging us thinking differently about China. Now we can move to the discussion section, yeah. But before we do so, I would like to invite Benjamin Ho to provide some comments, and let me introduce you very quickly. Benjamin Ho is assistant professor at the China program at Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And he's the author of the book published in 2021 titled China's Political Worldview and Chinese Exceptionalism, International Order and Global Leadership, published by Amsterdam University Press. Please, Benjamin, we welcome you.
Thank you, Anna. It's 10 p.m. in Singapore, but I can assure you this is one of the rare occasions where I'm extremely wide awake. And after hearing the earlier presenters, I was scribbling very furiously because there's so many very interesting points to highlight. So I will try and be succinct. I'm aware I've got about 10 minutes, so I'll make a couple of points and responses to each of these presenters, and then I'll highlight a few points on my own with regards to how I view China's place in the Indo-Pacific and more broadly in the world. And then after that, I'll pass the time back to you, if that's okay. So on Stephen David's presentation, I totally can empathize with where you're coming from. I had a privilege to spend 3 months in the United States during my Fulbright, and during those 3 months, it was an eye opener to really understand, well, at least a limited period, limited understanding, but nonetheless having this opportunity to sort of understand how the American mindset towards global politics, towards their own sense of who they are, is being formed. So if I read you correctly, I think what you are essentially arguing is that right now there seems to be some very fundamental clash in terms of how the US sees itself, its own values, and how the Chinese sees itself and its own values. But I think one area that you might want to think about, and this goes back to what earlier Humphrey did mention, and that is really about domestic governance. Because right now, and this is also in Singapore, just 2 weeks later, many of us will be going up to the ISA in San Francisco. And right now, a lot of concerns is what is exactly happening in the United States. I'm not just talking about politically, the contestation, because that is normal. That's par for the ground in a liberal democracy like the United States. But the bigger concern is issues of crime, issues of drugs, gun violence, and these are the phenomena that keeps appearing in the news. And it's not just in the Global Times, but even in CNN. Each time there is a shooting incident, these events become magnified. And I think there is somewhat of a concern, I'm sure in United States, but certainly in Asia, that the United States is no longer that beautiful country, as the Chinese would call it, 美国, that it was 20, 30 years ago. So something is happening there. And I think if you look from the point of view of Asia, certainly in Singapore, it is not just about international order or about who leads the world or having international hegemony, but really who is able to deliver the goods back home that makes the country worthy of emulation, or in this case, becomes cannon fodder for criticism. So I think that is something that and we need to think about. What is domestic governance and things happening back home? Certainly, there are issues with populism, but I think the key point over here is what it means about if the United States values are that which the US believes as good and therefore worthy of emulation, then the bigger question is what is happening to the United States right now, and should we follow the US? I think for many years in countries in Asia, there is always that understanding that the US leads, and we are happy to follow its lead because of the positive things. But right now, I think those are being questioned, and I think it's also part of this internal debate within the United States. So that's my response. Of course, my question to you is, indeed, your analysis is correct. Do you see any common ground between the US and China, and what that common ground might be? Jing Han, it's good to see you online this time. I hope we get to meet again in person. I completely agree with you. I think your analysis of the varying levels of the central-local relations and the fact that China is not monolithic and not a unitary actor, and there is no coherent sort of strategy to the BRI. I think this is well taken, especially among scholars of Chinese politics. We are all aware that there is always some kind of incoherence and incongruence between what is formally demanded and what is informally being put out. You mentioned, I guess the question that I have for you is really more what is happening now, given China's own economic problems. How do you foresee the BRI? I mean, I don't look specifically at the BRI, but my own sensing is that this has been really muted of late. Of course, you still have got the big BRI forum last year, the 10th anniversary. But my concern is, what should we expect? Is this just simply part of Chinese propaganda? But I think the more important question is, so I take your point that the BRI has certainly allowed China to put forth build its relations with developing countries very well. But what about developed countries? And I think this is where for China to have global influence, it is not just about being able to build bridges in Africa or undeveloped parts of Southeast Asia, important as they might be for the development of those places. But what about bigger things? What about, of course, the most recent one would be the Chinese homemade aircraft, the C919, which made its debut in Singapore. And I think that really got a lot of attention. So my question is really, can an authoritarian system like what is happening in China able to sort of take China to the next level? Because that would require more than just the ability to build bridges. I think it is more about, for lack of a better term, higher order sort of thinking that is often associated with democracies or in regimes where people are allowed to sort of really put on their creative hats. I mean, the biggest concern was that China was, in its crackdown on some of the tech giants, China is essentially cutting its nose to spite its face, and that is not a good thing. So maybe you could make some comments about the future of China's economy, given the current situation we are in. And my final point to Humphrey, I'm glad that you are a journalist. I studied journalism as my first degree, so it's really good to hear you being able to put forth your points in such a interesting manner. I guess my question to you, I don't have much disagreement with your points because I think those are very well articulated. But my question really, it's about the issue of international order. So I think right now the concern is not so much as to whether what China is doing back home, and at some point it will definitely do well. And even one could argue that President Xi is not going to be around forever. All of us are mortal. Xi is mortal. But the question is really that of international order, because for a long time, countries in the Indo-Pacific and certainly Southeast Asia, my country included, are very contented with a US-led international order. Indeed, if China does not have any intention to challenge this order, then it's perfectly fine. We can let China grow, and maybe its growth will sort of taper. But I think the worry is that if China wants to change or make changes to this order, how is this going to sit with countries in the region who are very used to an American way of the one what's called a liberal or maybe rules-based international order? What would be Chinese rules, and would these rules enable countries in the region to prosper and thrive? So that's about all for the comments. I got a few more points, but I think I realized I'm also out of time, and there are people who I'm sure would have questions as well. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Benjamin, thank you very much. Yes, we would like to leave some time for the audience as well to pose their questions. Great analysis and great questions, great big questions. Stephen, would you like to begin?
Sure. Benho had very good comments on my presentation. I'd like to, if I could, I'd like to take a lot of time to answer them. I realize I don't have that, so I'm going to be very, very brief. I think he asked two basic questions. Is America still an example for others to follow, despite all its problems of crime and poverty, inequality, whatever? And I'd say yes. I mean, America is surely very much of an imperfect country, but the American ideal, the American idea of liberal democracy is something that in various forms I would like to see embraced by others in the world. It doesn't mean they have to copy America perfectly, but the notion of limited government and individual rights and then the belief of democracy is something that I feel is largely universal and very, very different from the Chinese vision. I would just go on to say that America is not as bad as the news media portrays us. Yes, we've got crime and gun violence and et cetera, but the American economy is the strongest in the world. It's defied expectations in terms of its growth. There's a lot to learn and a lot to follow in America. That said, I think the greatest threat to America and the American ideal comes not from China or Russia or Iran, but within the United States itself. I mean, the political divisions in America are the worst I've ever seen in my lifetime. And not to be overly partisan, I think if Donald Trump is elected president, American democracy is truly in danger. And that worries me the most. Very quickly on Are there common ground between America and China? Yes, of course. We both have to accept the notion we're not going to eliminate the other. The US isn't going to get rid of the CCP, and the Chinese communists are not going to push America aside. So we have to learn to live with each other. I hope we can continue to cooperate in certain areas like pandemics, counterterrorism, the spread of nuclear weapons, climate change. There's a fundamental truth that we have much more to gain by cooperating with one another than engaging in conflict with one another. Yes, there will be differences of opinion. China is a rising power that is challenging America's liberal international order, but that doesn't mean we have to go to war. And I'm hoping that the benefits of economic interdependence and the fear of nuclear war will be enough to keep us on the peaceful path. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Stephen. Jinhan, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ho, for all the very insightful comments. Just very quickly to respond to your three questions. I think first one is what happened with BRI now, what might be we expect in the future. I think clearly when you go back to when the BRI was first announced, it was about big infrastructure. State-owned enterprise came here to do something big, something great. But I think the trend of doing that has already shifted even before the pandemic. There was a discussion within China over strategic overstretch to say whether probably China has been doing something that not compatible with its economic size. So that big infrastructure kind of BRI is already gone. It's no longer be there. I think for lots of reasons, funding and environmental, lots of reasons. And Xi Jinping had made it clear they want to go through more of a small and beautiful project. That's very much kind of project that will be beneficial in, for example, Africa, Middle East to the general public, like small build rather than the province. Big ambitious kind of project attract attentions. So I think that's the direction we're going. And the second trend will be the rise of digital Silk Road. I think we have been organizing the Belt and Road Conference every year, and we do see that the topic on the digital Silk Road has significantly grown in the past few years. I think that check a few boxes. The first box is private actor's role has been rising in the BRI. And also when you come to like the tech China is doing, Alibaba, Tencent, those kind of things, that fits in generally China's kind of goal to become a global digital leader. So we do see that kind of a rise of information communication technology of Chinese kind of company goes to Middle East, Africa, and those places to do that. So I think those two trends will be very significant. Much less, no longer a big infrastructure project, the rise of digital Silk Road. And this remains that make the BRI continue to be a big slogan, big kind of project of the century, but its content is significantly different from what it was before. Your second question is about what about China's relation with developed country, right? I think for the US side, there was a big hope things can change a few years ago. But I think after a few tries, China kind of get it that no matter what you do, you are not going to go back to what it was before 2016. I think that was kind of consensus now. And China has been quietly saying, observing this election going to the US, what things might be, but it wasn't very optimistic about how US-China relation might go. On Europe, I think it was a very different kind of hope. China would be hope that Europe can become more autonomous from Washington to make its own decisions, so that the US-China confrontation remains a conflict between two countries rather than China's clash with the West. So for China, if Europe can remain an independent kind of polar, separate from the US-China conflicts, that would be really good. So you do see that kind of engagement approach towards Europe. Especially Brussels. And the third question is, what's next level for China rather than building bridges? I think that's definitely true. I think what we have heard from the headlines more about problems rather than bring China to the next level, right? We see the slowdown of Chinese economy, property crisis, the decline of demography, US-China relations, and they become worse and worse. So I think it's less about bring China to the next level. It's more about how to focus on the current crisis, or probably a little bit more crisis management. And I think the current focus of the government has been focusing on deliver growth target, and hope that with that continued growth, things might change. as on stage in the longer run. And if you're really saying, ask what then is a game changer, what might really bring China to the next level, and I probably will say might be AI and high tech. That's something China is counting on. Now there's a national kind of campaign mobilizing China investing in AI, and I hope that that is really a secret to upgrade China to the next level, solving all the problems we talk about, slowdown of Chinese economy, decline of demography, and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Humphrey, would you continue, please?
Yes, and thank you, Benjamin, for your energy and your thoughts. I've always thought of Singapore, originated by Lee Kuan Yew, as the intellectual heart of Asian values and the Indo-Pacific. I think that the biggest threat at the moment to the world order is the election of Donald Trump. So that's being originated from a liberal democracy that is in paralysis because of the stuff that you mentioned over the gun control, these sort of things, and also they won't reform the electoral college, which lets a minority election get in. So there's a whole element there, coupled with its refusal or lack of acknowledgement about what led to the past 30 years of failure. The Belt and Road essentially replaces a demand from the market for infrastructure that the West failed to deliver during those periods because they linked building a bridge with a democratic vote or gender equality or something like that, and China didn't do that. But if Donald Trump gets in, everybody is going to be asking questions, as in the Indo-Pacific they are now, as we are now in Europe, about the future of NATO, about whether American troops are going to withdraw from Japan and South Korea, whether those two nations are going to go nuclear. There's a whole rethinking done. What I would like to see, Benjamin, is for Singapore, a Singaporean think tank or a Southeast Asian think tank, to draw up a world order that would be acceptable to China and the US, or a card for debate, let's say, so that we can have a document that everybody can look at. Because as we discussed earlier on, as we heard from my two fellow panelists, there is a divide here, but actually there's a lot more common ground than divide. China does not have an ideology. It's not the Soviet Union. It's trying to get those light switches turned on, and it's got a market because the other bits of the global South want the bridges built as well. We have turned what we had as democracy, which we thought was the best system of government that would turn those light bulbs on, we've turned that into a religion and an ideology. So we have to temper all that down, meet in the middle, and rethink the phrases within the world order, like what should China's membership of the International Monetary Fund be? What percentage should it have a bigger role, or should anybody have a bigger role in the World Bank? What should the United Nations Security Council comprise? What should its powers be? How much power should be given to the United Nations General Assembly? These are how the world is going to evolve without conflict. My fear is that Xi Jinping becomes like Saddam or Gaddafi or Assad in Syria, and there is a Gulf of Tonkin type of incident that sparked the war in Vietnam that is fabricated through the prairie fire of Western democracy, which pushes Western leaders into a situation where they have to go into conflict. I don't think China wants that, but I think that our Western democracy, the way it works at the moment with the media at the moment, might become a catalyst to that. Benjamin, it's up to you to sort it.
Thank you. Thank you. If anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your digital Zoom hand, so we can see it. Otherwise, here in the chat box, we have two questions. One on Africa and China's role in Africa, and one question on China's capacity to shape the future of global governance and geopolitical dynamics. Any of you would like to respond to these two questions?
I think I'll repeat, but I'll give it. I think China can shape, but we should look at China as a collegiate shaper of it, not as a military threat. And I think if we track, I think the UN General Assembly, which I just referenced, is a guide to this, because it's becoming a kind of world opinion parliament. It doesn't have the power. But if you look at the Ukraine vote there, which went diametrically against Russia, but also look at the vote there on Britain's sovereignty claim to the Indian Ocean, which was ruled against by an international court, but Britain has ignored that ruling. Whereas China ignored the ruling of a similar international court and is called a pariah, and Britain ignores the ruling and nothing happens. These are the contradictions that are talked about in the global South. And if the West is to continue, as Stephen David said, I mean, still a great place with all its things, but if it is continue to hold that, and it's a little bit on a precipice at the moment, it needs to accept these contradictions and iron them out. So when you go to the negotiating table, you don't have fingers pointing at you saying, well, why are you telling us to have the rule of law here, but you're breaking the rule of law there? That doesn't work.
I would just say I would be a little concerned about a world where the UN General Assembly had a great amount of power and the global South dictated what the international order should be. And I'm not saying Humphrey Huxley suggested that, but I'm a little wary of the world's future being determined by countries, for the most part, autocratic, don't respect individual liberties, and as hypocritical, if not more, than the situation we find in the West. And in terms of meeting China halfway, I'm not sure what that means. I think I have more faith in liberal democracy broadly conceived than Mr. Huxley does.
But what is the China threat, Stephen?
Well, the China threat is they are growing military power. They're the world's biggest army, the world's biggest navy. They're openly talking about invading Taiwan, a democratic, prosperous country. It's a big threat out there. You don't see that as a threat?
No, what I see is they are doing pretty much what the US and we did during the Monroe Doctrine period. I think we spilled a lot more blood than they've spilled. And I do see that it could be viewed as a threat, but the more you accuse a rival of being a threat, the more you push them into a corner of lashing back against that accusation.
No, look, I am not a China hawk. What I'm seeing in my country, in America, one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus is hatred of China, and I'm trying to work against that.
Yeah,
That said, it certainly is a challenge to American interests, a challenge to Western democracy. It's claimed to control 90% of the South China Sea. I mentioned Taiwan. There are trade issues, there are human rights issues. I'm hoping that we can keep these issues on the back burner and that they don't lead to war. But to ignore the fact that China does challenge core American and Western interests, I think is mistaken.
All right. All right. I don't see at the moment the digital hands here. Yeah. Therefore, I would like to thank our panelists for this splendid opportunity to discuss China. Stephen David, Jinghan Zheng, Humphrey Huxley, and Benjamin Ho. Thank you so much for your input, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Brilliant sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
So I think without any further interruption, it's time to move on to final panel discussion. This is Ibrahim Öztürk, organizer of this symposium. I would like to thank all of you for your participation and insightful contributions. The fourth panel will be moderated by my colleague, Patrick Holden. Welcome, Holden, on our panel discussion. The floor is yours to proceed further. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. It's great to be here. I'm myself a specialist in economic diplomacy, and so this panel on the economic implications of rising populism and multipolarity is close to my heart. I'm not sure, do we have both panelists yet? So we might give it a minute or two. I saw Professor Sacerdote, but I think he's disappeared again, and we also have Professor Kenny. Yes, oh, hello. I'm waiting to see. We're also expecting Professor Paul Kenny from the Australian Catholic University. So I suppose we'll give it a minute or two, Ibrahim, will we? We can't hear you.
Ibrahim, you are mute.
Let me send him a last minute email. I couldn't see his name here, but we can start with Professor Sacerdote, if you don't mind.
Ibrahim is Paul Kenny in Australia?
Yes.
It's nearly 2 o'clock in the morning in Australia.
At the moment, really, I don't know where he is living, but he confirmed.
Okay.
If there is no miscalculation of time difference by him, which is happening very often
today,
unfortunately, as it happened today. So I have to send him an email now.
Okay.
Well, I suppose, I can introduce, although he probably needs no introduction, Dr. Giorgio Sacerdote, Professor of Law from Bocconi University, and very distinguished former chairman of the WTO appellate body, and someone with very extensive and deep insights into international trade and economic diplomacy. I would note also there was another panelist, Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero, who is an expert on the Asia Pacific, also from Natixis, but the French Investment Bank. But unfortunately, she can't come. So let us wait and see. But we'll do this as usual with the presenters first, and then we'll take questions in different formats. Would you be happy to begin now, Dr. Sacerdote?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll mute myself and hand over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you and the distinguished guest, and let's call it the public in these 2 days that you have so ably organized on pressing problem of today, let's say globalization issues. And I have dealt with these since a long time, because when I was at the appellate body of the WTO between 2001 and 2009, those were the high years maybe of optimism toward the increasing globalization and international cooperation in economic matters to govern the various multifaceted issues that have been we were facing then, with an emphasis. There was the Doha round that started to gear international trade towards the benefit of developing countries, and then the issue of sustainable development and climate change, which slowly came into us a new agenda intertwined with those of trade. There was, however, afterwards a financial crisis, and then there were the years developing, and then the Trump administration with its fierce stance against multinationalism in economic matters, maybe also in other matters, and the idea that America first, American jobs, bring back jobs home, the idea that foreign economies were not a partner in development with the United States, but rather unfair competitors that would harm the American economy and the American workers, and especially against China, looking how China had been developing so brilliantly, let's say, in recent decades after having entered the WTO in 2001. There is not a cause effect phenomenon, but surely China profited, as other countries, from the freedom of commerce, the lowering of the barriers. It became, as we know, the factory of the world, where cheap products could be manufactured and imported, also to keep down the prices to the consumers in industrialized countries, but at the same time putting pressure on competition for local producers and local communities where industries were affected and sometimes went even out of business in this change of terms of trade, let's say. But I think the phenomenon that these phenomena, I think, were, and seen in retrospect, are the normality of international trade that benefits both ends of the equation. Countries which are already well established and find new markets by the lowering of barriers were to amplify the activities of their company. And this doesn't mean just export, of course, but also direct investment, factories there, furnishing the supply chain back to the home country. And the countries which slowly or rapidly come into the network of international trade can develop broader markets and benefit from foreign investors and enter into a globalized economy. Nothing new with China. There was Japan before. There was Germany after the war with the rebuild of the German industry and the German economy, and also through regional agreement, of which also the US finally joined with the NAFTA, building blocks that would amplify between neighboring countries and complementary economies this trend. This, as we know, has changed your outlook in the middle of the past decade, I would say. The ascent of Trump administration with its protectionist inclination, also phenomena like Brexit, so the idea that the UK by itself could do better in the world arena than being a leading member of the European Union, difficulties in getting new agreements liberalizing, like the Doha round, which failed, the big exchange between opening of the agricultural market in developed countries against the opening to industrial products in the south of the world didn't work. And also the new sensitivities, I would say, to non-trade issues, labor, environment, fundamental human rights, and also more traditional aspects like the recourse to subsidies, issues for which the WTO, which is the pillar of multilateralism, one big hopes in the middle of the 90s, does provide instrument to ensure that international multilateral trade be also a fair trade, but maybe through instruments that are not up to date for new aspects of international trade, things the digital economy, for instance, and also the difficulty of combining protecting non-trade values together with the objective of freer trade. Where do we stand now? I call my intervention politicization of international trade relations. I think this is an important aspect until the philosophy, I think, on which the post-World War II trade relation was premises was that one could manage and organize trade relation based on legal rules which would be equal for all, with some protection for weaker countries, some encouragement for preferential treatment for developing countries, and so. But that would be independent from political clashes. Not, of course, if you would have really a war, but in general, the idea that, on the contrary, liberalization of trade, exchange of goods, which means also investment, means businessmen. It doesn't include, as we know, migration, but still qualified workers, would be conducive to a more friendly world and could be in part independent from different point of views on the world, the domestic economy, and the international setting. Of course, after the fall of the wall and the demise of the communist system in the early 90s, the entry of so many countries in the more market-oriented or capitalistic system has fueled this development. This development was based on what were the principles, may I recall them. So removing border barriers, but also internal discriminations against imported products, so MFN and national treatment, a reduction by mutual exchange of barriers in periodic rounds, equality of treatment, except for the preferential treatment for developing countries and regional agreements. The origin of the product would not matter as to its treatment in international trade. The protection was there, however, but it was an instrument for exceptional against unfair trade, dumping by enterprises, or unfair trade by government, subsidies, provided they were specific to help specific export industries to gain unfairly, let's say, against market principle, shares of the world market. And then the WTO, so 94, 95, 96, was also premised that all these complex rules would extend also to certain domestic regulation, the quality of products, the TBT, the rules of origin, the specification of product that are more and more important for the protection of the consumer, the environment, but basically would not be used to protect domestic industries. And therefore, the avoidance of domestic discriminations. All these rules were also premised that there would be a system of dispute settlement by which the members of the WTO, which were about, if I well remember, 90 in 95 and increased rapidly, now there are more than 160, almost all world trade is covered by the WTO rules. Very few countries are out, Iran, Algeria, and a few small economies, that there would be a system to guarantee that members would play to the rules. And if barriers would be raised that were contrary to the commitment taken, then there would be a speedy system, independent, based on the application of the provision, not biased for bigger countries or old members and so on, to withdraw restrictive measures, usually by importing countries, and re-establish the balance of rights and duties. What happened in the middle of around 2015 and so with the Trump administration were a host of protectionist measures that the US introduced, which were not based on the rules of the system. There was first a general disengagement by the US from actively being member of a system which the US itself had established with the ITO, with the GATT in the late 40s, and the adoption of measures regardless of their compatibility with the WTO. These were measures, the trade war against China with massive increase of custom duties on hundreds of billions of imports, but there were also the steel and aluminum increase of duties, which were raised against all importers into the United States, including the allies, European countries, Canada, Mexico, officially for economic security reasons, but in fact to protect the American steel industry. If you read the Financial Times of yesterday or the day before, I mean, this ludicrous motivation, the steel industry has 80,000 employees in the United States, 0.006 of the working force, but it carries, of course, a lot of tradition. And when you see now that the proposed acquisition by Nippon Steel of America, of US Steel, raises lots of objections. Even President Biden said recently that he is against, notwithstanding economic argument, political friendship, and so on. This, of course, has put strain on the commercial relations because the countries which were the victim of these measures and were the export made more difficult to go inside the American market, answered with retaliation because they couldn't get justice speedily, let's say, at the WTO. So you had a lose-lose dynamic, and this dynamic has increased recently massively because of this extended concept of economic security. We must say that in the philosophy of the GATT, which was carried on in the WTO, economic security is an exception by which a country can retreat from its commitment of liberalization in cases of grave international crisis, similar to war or of that type. This is clearly so because this was the philosophy of the 40s, the one which would isolate economy and trade from political differences, except if you would go to a situation similar to war or crisis of international relations. Now, instead, invoking economic security to raise of 20% steel and aluminum tariff on imported products from Canada, and the European Union and UK, claiming this is a national security problem, is stretching this concept beyond the limits of what had been considered. And in fact, those panels, those arbitrators at the WTO, which have looked into the matter, and the first case was interesting. For 60 years, there were no case under the security exception of the GATT, Article 21, and then there have been a host, Ukraine, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and then especially against the United States before this measure. They all have said this goes well beyond the rules, and especially cannot be self-judging. That is, a country cannot raise its hand without, no, I don't pay anymore to the root because this is my economic security. Basically, you can judge what is your economic security, but you cannot unilaterally withdraw without at least being subject to countermeasures or giving compensation to other countries. This concept of economic security, however, and this is the point I would like to do, has been extended considerably later on, because we all know this. It has been extended by the US vis-à-vis China to micromanagement of trade, so specific companies, Huawei, then pushing other countries not to export products like vis-à-vis Holland, exporting machinery that would make modern chips to China, then reducing the import of certain products for having the domestic industry and economy not being dependent on foreign products, blocking, as we said, the export of products that might give the Chinese industry competitive advantage and a technological jump in respect of the United States. So there has been a host of political interference with international trade. Then we have the big subsidy, which by itself, the idea that you have to help our industries for the transition to the green economy is correct, and it was done also in the past. But if you take the Inflation Reduction Act of the United States, which is really meant to give a boost to the modernization of American industry, of course, it tips the balance of trade, just like the Chinese subsidies to the electrical vehicles or to the electrical batteries to make them cheaper, more competitive, and acquire export shares in foreign market. So all this disrupts the balance that was thought. Then we come to the protection of the environment, the climate change. So the green subsidies, are they, of which also Europe now is practicing and speaking of, are they really green? Are they justified? I don't say legally probably they are not, but also politically and economically, or do they protect, like the European car industry, which hasn't moved quick enough towards electrical vehicles? Then you have measures to apparently or nominally equalize the situation between countries that are more heavily engaged in fighting climate change through higher standard of production of the industry, take the EU, and other countries who produce still with more pollution. So you have this CBAM, which is practically an extra custom duties on products imported into the EU. If they don't, the factories, the countries of origin don't justify that they are produced with the same environmental standard than in the European Union. It's just now getting into progressive in place, but now already you see developing countries protesting. But then there are other things which are a lot of goodwill, but what are the effects? The EU directive on deforestation, agricultural products and cattle coming into the EU to demonstrate that the land where they have been produced has not been eroded from deforestry against sustainable management of the forest. Then you have the human rights, the Uyghur, the Xinjiang, but applicable also to other, with the importer which has to justify or be ready to justify that in supply chain, so even products produced by independent foreign producers are not produced with the use of slave labor or forced labor or similar situation. Once upon a time, the WTO was based on the idea that production methods in a foreign country would not be the business of the importing country. The US started with these environmental standards in the 19th, saying, well, the tuna fish, which is in the can that come from Mexico, the tuna should be fished in the same sustainable fishery system that the US has, because otherwise it's against the competition, the consumer would complain, and this we see similar things now in Europe. The plastic wrapping from foreign products should be the plastic produced with non-polluted mechanism like in EU, under which the foreign countries rightly or wrongly say we must have time to adapt. This is an easy way to foreclose to our products the domestic market. So between outright politicization, using what has been called the weaponization of trade, maybe this is even excessive, protectionism meant to upgrade the industry to the new necessities, so the electricity, the vehicle, the energy, and so on, and political interference with specific supply and value chains, promoting the reshoring, you know, this term, the reshoring, the nearshoring, the friendshoring, so that companies would be nudged, induced, if not forced, not to obtain their components from China or certain other countries, but from friendly countries. Then you see the politicization of trade, that there are less imports into the United States from China of certain products, but there are more from Mexico. And then it said that Chinese export in Mexico and transform in Mexico, and then saw the reaction of certain sectors in the United States. Yeah, now we have to check Mexico. So the excessive, I think, politicization of trade, first of all, in my view, I am rather liberal in this, as you can understand, doesn't bring about the results that have been, that were sort of. I mean, this reminds me the Made in Germany fight between the Great Britain and the German Reich before the First World War. You may know that the mark made in was an obligation that was put in England against Germany, made in Germany. Therefore, there were products were coming from unfriendly country enemies, although then Germany was probably as much developed industrially or even more than England, to dissuade the English consumer from buying German goods. It didn't work very much. So the same was dissuading the American consumer in the 70s to buy Japanese cars that were more efficient, smaller, less polluting, and so on. So the recourse to the weaponization of trade is a double-edged sword that should be used very cautiously. And now we are also, and I finish the last point, you say, well, but the WTO has those dispute settlement mechanism to enforce its rules. But here the US made a shrewd maneuver by blocking the second stage, the appellate body, by opposing the renovation and the replacement of the judges. So slow, petit à petit, the 7 judges have become 3, then 1, then 0. So the system is semi-paralyzed. So it's true that the panels have said that the security exception used for steel and aluminum tariff by the US was contrary to WTO rules, but then the US appealed to the appellate body, which is not operated. The case stands there, there is no decision, and therefore we are in a situation in which multilateral rules are there, but they are often disregarded, and there is no empire able to enforce them. Then maybe we, in the Q&A period, maybe we'll see what is the outlook now after the last ministerial meeting of the WTO in the Emirates 2 weeks ago, which was, however, rather disappointing as to results. Here I am, my friend.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a masterful overview of the situation we're in, and I think a strong defense of, we might say, a liberal view on things. I have to report that for the other panelists, I can't make it either, so we're rich in time, although there's plenty to talk about. Now, I've got lots of questions, but I will not abuse my position, so I will open it up either in the chat or we're a small enough group, I think, to do verbally if you wish as well. I will open it up to any questions or comments for the professor. Ibrahim?
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Sakardote. Am I properly pronouncing your surname? Sorry for that. Please correct me if my pronunciation of your surname.
Thank you. My surname is very difficult to pronounce in Italian. So in Italy, it is Sacerdoti. In France, it becomes Sacerdoti. In England, in it became Sacer. In Germany, Sacerdote. And in English, it's whatever you wish. So Sacerdote is fine.
Yeah, completely understandable. I am working on Japan, Japanese economy. I have been to there. So in terms of pronunciation of my surname, I am very unlucky to live in Japan, because my surname is totally catastrophic for the Japanese to pronunciate, as it involves many letters which cannot properly pronunciate. So anyway, we communicate somehow. Professor, many thanks for your participation and that wonderful speech composed of different dimensions of the problem. But what I would like to learn or get your view is the implication of your perspective regarding the future of populist authoritarians. Let me clarify my question. I am also personally observing that global supply chains are relocating from China to India. Mainly Japanese companies and the US companies are very much active in terms of that relocation of supply chains. And India is rising in that regard. But we know India, there is a very much authoritarian-oriented populist Modi government in India, and he is getting more and more authoritarian, by the way. So we can say that in terms of economics, market economy, he is very much market-oriented person. But in terms of politics, he is becoming increasingly more and more divisive, religious-oriented, civilization-oriented populism is becoming increasingly more and more dangerous, mainly between Muslim and Indian people. So on the one hand, there is a need for the relocation of supply chain from China to other alternative markets, mainly in India. But on the other hand, it seems that we are under the pressure to ignore increasing authoritarian tendencies of those countries. That means we are very much interested in the sustainability of our economic interests rather than trying to force those leaders to adopt more democratic-oriented measures, more human right-oriented policies. So I think in terms of the future of populist authoritarianism, we are not in a hopeful path in that regard. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, you're engaging me on more political outlook. It's, I don't know whether populism or nationalism necessarily goes together with protectionism. Basically, one would think yes, because you want by political means to develop your domestic economy. But there is also the traditional imperialistic in the 19th century, by which countries were nationalists and tried to affirm themselves in foreign markets, where at the time of the colonies and so on. And then there is also the aspect, you take India, a very large developing economy, that idea, you are an economist more than I am, of the theory of developing the domestic market and national champions by protecting protective barriers in trade. But of course, if you want then that your companies export, you have to let the others come in. And now there have been exchanges also yesterday or today on the Financial Times. India made an FTA, which is quite interesting, not with the UK or the EU, large economies with which negotiations are there, apparently have not moved along, but with the former EFTA countries, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein. And there, India granted market opening to industries of those countries. Imagine the Swiss industry is very modern and efficient, but against not just reciprocal market opening, because probably the markets of these countries are quite small and maybe are not interested in Indian products, but against commitment to make investment in India. Within 5 years, there should be, or 3 years, $100 million new investment from these countries to India. And if this is not so, then India could withdraw some of these trade benefits, opening trade that it has given in this agreement. So this is quite a novelty, to exchange the decrease of trade barriers with a quantitative objective of committing to investment, because then the investment is private investment from Switzerland and Norway. So how will then these countries use their companies to establish factories in India and therefore give work to Indian workers? And there is then, India is also interested with the UK, for instance, a commitment of labor, of experts, IT, Indian IT experts, so that they may get long-term visa, or if they study in UK university, they may remain there. So there is, it's not just apples against pears, but it's apples and pears against workers or investment. I think this is an interesting aspect of using trade for more bespoke necessities or objective of the specific country negotiating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just because it's so core to our theme, I'll comment briefly. This link between populism and trade policy, as the professor said, it's not incredibly clear. There are examples, of course, Bolsonaro in Brazil would be a classic case of someone who was certainly a populist, but at least in terms of his intentions, he was quite open to different types of trade agreements. And as the professor said, I think it's a very important research agenda, is linkage of trade policies with different issues, whether it's migration or investment commitments. Of course, it's been linked with aid for some time, but often not legally actionable. But that's been a common link. And in the past, of course, we always spoke about trade and world over in relation to currencies and monetary coordination as well. But I should read a comment and a question from Bulent, who thanks the professor for his talk. And in light of his presentation, how do you anticipate the possibility of a new trade war between the US and China in the event of a resurgence of Trump And what measures do you believe are crucial to uphold the principles of the multilateral global trading system? So that's a two-part question. Will Trump create a new trade war with China? And your general advice for how to maintain a relatively open multilateral trading system?
Well, you know, what is said around is Trump is unpredictable more than one side or the other. It would be even possible that the US goes all the way and withdraws from the WTO, and the idea circulating in the right to deny China the most favored nation clause. Well, treatment. What does that mean? That's the backbone of the WTO and of the GATT. So would be already the US is doing something like that, with having increased massively tariffs. Then they made a bilateral agreement by which some tariffs had been reduced, but also China has increased its own tariff. I mean, the US is probably for many products the most important export market for many countries, but the big shift is, of course, that the world is less unipolar now than 30 years ago, and for many American companies, the foreign markets are important, of course. Excuse me, the balance of payment of the US is different from other countries. I mean, big revenues flow from abroad to the US, thanks to royalties, to the movies, to the literature, the technology, the banks, the use of the financial system. So for the US, it's not the fact that the export market is probably a foreign market, that's export markets for goods, are much less important than, I don't know, it could be for Italy. But when I finish, one of the question is, it's unpredictable. If you see the surveys made among CEOs or so, it's that the world has become more uncertain, that you cannot rely just on past patterns, on established, even binding rules, and that therefore this translates into costs probably. You have to keep more inventory. You may have to have your ship go circumnavigate Africa because the Houthis are blocking the Red Sea and things like that. Purely politics.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I mean, the Red Sea situation is very dramatic and clearly damaging for Egypt, in particular because of the revenue it gets, but also for southern Mediterranean European countries like Greece and Italy are, of course, very, very anxious about it. Does anyone else have a question or would like to contribute?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Professor Sajidoti, for your enlightening presentation. I guess I wanted to pick a little bit up on a tangential point related to what Ibrahim had raised, and in particular about reshoring and nearshoring, and how this is kind of strengthening the impact or the salience of regional trade zones and arrangements. It seems to me that this regionalization of free trade is both political, but also a response to actual management of trade in a way that's somehow more flexible. And relatedly, I wanted to ask about policy making in other global fora that have this political flexible characteristic. But and I guess I was thinking of the G7 tax deal on the global minimum tax. It's maybe more a question for Patrick, of course, but there does seem to be scope in international fora that are not global for actual progress in policy making. And I thought I'd pick your brains on those two questions. Thanks.
But you have the floor, I think, It's more for Simon, this question, is it?
Well, Patrick, what do you think?
Well, I think that I suppose you call it plurilateral, would you, Simon? You're talking about these arrangements which have been ongoing for a while, and of course the true believers in free trade, like Wati and whatever, would always have criticized them as being distortive and in various senses not helpful for the vision of developing a truly global and open trading system. But in the current context, I suppose they could well be viewed as the next best thing. But what's going to happen is of course that they are exclusive. They're going to be excluding some partners, and you have to see how these are reacted to, and also of course how they are implemented. Because of course in some world regions that there is quite a history of signing agreements for political purposes and maybe not fully implementing them. And that's always, of course, a problem with traditional trade agreements, even because there isn't very robust often enforcement of them. You mentioned it, obviously, the G7 Global Tax Agreement, which I think was very important in principle. I do have to follow up personally how they are implementing it, but I don't think anyone believes that they can close all the loopholes, particularly for tech companies. But it does, I think, send an important message. It's had an impact in Europe, actually, in the European Union, where you had holdout countries like my own. I'm Irish, though I work in the UK, which had been refusing to increase its minimum corporate tax rate for years. But when the Americans got involved, they had to give up and have agreed to do that at least. So it's so that I think would be the answer. The answer there, but plurilateralism, I think in the WTO as well is the future. And I do have a question for the professor on that. It's about the appellate board, which has been frozen, as you said. The EU has tried this. It's called MPIA, or the Multi-Panel Interim Appeal Board. It's just a grouping of like-minded countries, I think the EU, Canada, and Norway, where they agree to use this as a backdoor to dispute settlement or appealing dispute settlement from. How important is this, do you think, or is it, because it's obviously only going to be by countries that are willing to join it? Is it significant, or is it just a public relations thing?
No, well, that's a good point. So the appellate body is paralyzed, and since the WTO works by consensus, basically, it's enough that the United States blocks the decision for the appointment, the selection of new judges, that the court or the appellate body, which is not fully a court, but I mean operates and has a function of a court, doesn't work now. And this goes down and paralyzes the system, because if countries go in front of the first level panel and they win or lose, then if they don't agree to accept the decision, which now happens rarely, and they can, the loser can appeal, and the appeal remains indefinitely. So in order to circumvent this blocking, and this is also interesting, I mean, the weaknesses sometimes institutional designs have. So the WTO works by consensus to have everybody on board in regulating international trade, and then it gives a veto right, in this case, to the United States, and blocks also the other countries, because if the EU and China want to go to a dispute, there's no appellate body even for them. So the countries, every month or 2 months, there is a meeting at the dispute settlement body, the WTO, and there are now 130 countries that each time put on the agenda selection of appointed appellate body members. and the US say, we don't agree, and that's it. So there is, I mean, notwithstanding this politicization, it will cost to subsidy, especially smaller countries which have less big, the market is smaller, they don't have the resources to give big subsidies, and rely on exports, are in favor of the multilateral system. So this solution was found as a temporary solution based on the agreements. Practically, there are now 25 countries, calculating the EU as one, which have agreed, instead of the appellate body, to have a kind of appellate arbitration. They have already made the whole scheme. So if they have a dispute among themselves, they agree that if one of the parties will want to appeal, they will trigger this appeal arbitration. So they can go on among themselves. And they are important partners because the EU, Canada, China, Brazil, I think, Japan joined, UK not yet, apparently, for bureaucratic reasons. Of course, not the United States. You cannot sue at the WTO the United States. It's a second best that can work, and still, since it's not likely that the United States will change its view, whatever administration, because they try. I mean, the US has never been in favor of international binding judiciary arbitration. If the US has to participate, the US courts are against that. It was really maybe an exception that they accepted at the WTO. It's not called a court, it's not a tribunal, it's an hybrid mechanism, but they accepted that they had a binding settlement of dispute. But now they see that many cases have gone against them, also in favor of them, as always happens. And they exploit this comfortable situation that no one can challenge their restrictive measures. So the MPA is important, and I think it will get more members. For now, it has been there 2 years, 3 years. There has been only one case and another which was similar. So there haven't been so many disputes. Maybe the fact that the dispute system is half paralyzed diminishes also the appetite for going to these disputes. But there are disputes that are important. There is on environmental question. There is Indonesia and Malaysia against the European Union for the restriction to palm oil. Here you have the new type of dispute, which a decision from a panel came out recently. We'll see if one of the parties will appeal or not. And there are other disputes as well. Indonesia is not a part, India is not a part of the system, and maybe they have a wait-and-see attitude. But so the WTO is not default, but it's working at low speed, let's say.
Thank you. That's maybe more positive than I expected, but that's really interesting to know about that. Would anyone else have a point or a question? I have another quite big one. It's you mentioned it at the beginning, of course. It's received wisdom, certainly in America, that China entered the WTO and didn't fulfill its commitments or didn't comply. Is that really fair, or is that just sour grapes because the Chinese were able to produce more effectively? I know it's a big question, but I'd be very interested in your opinion on it, because, as I said, it's just become received wisdom that China was somehow cheating. But I don't know if you got that.
I wonder if there is a public, because if it's just me and you answering, we could wrap up a certain point. This very nice conversation, but we were supposed to be three. I am just alone.
Yes, yes. I think it's, I mean, Ibrahim, if we want to have a break before
I think if there is no extra questions, we can close the panel here, and we can immediately shift into our closing remarks by Professor Cengiz Aktar, who is our advisory board member, and he's also an economist. So I think it's time to close the session. Indeed, our entire symposium program. Thank you very much for your wonderful moderation, Patrick. And I would like to thank you once again, Professor Sakerdoti, for your wonderful presentation, enlightening views. And the floor is yours, Professor Akhtar.
Thank you. Greetings to all. Let me summarize. I've taken some notes on this 2 days panel. I think that our reflections on the fate of the multilateralism have shown limited rays of hope at the end of the tunnel. Well, multilateralism is externally trapped. We notice that in the Orwellian concept of multipolarity. And domestically speaking, it is challenged by populists at home who are in power. Well, actually, the present-day multilateralism, or the global rules-based order, as we call it, seems on the one hand to polarize rather than synergize. And on the other hand, to feed populist dynamics at home. I mean, we had several talks going along these lines. Well, the ECPS's honorary president, Irina von Wiese, has reminded us, for instance, the alarming state of populist illiberal undercurrents, particularly in her continent, Europe, including Russia. Dr. Axford yesterday, in his keynote, was observing that the new globalization is the context for the current populist surge, and in turn, that surge is the testimony to its emergence as a serious political force, perhaps as an embedded global script. As for Dr. Patrick, the crisis of the rules-based order complicates international cooperation in multiple domains, and particularly in the field of global economic governance. A few minutes ago, in this way, Dr. Sacerdoti recalled that the need for governments to ensure their economic security, to protect employment, safeguard national control of the economy through industrial policies, and to preserve, of course, local manufacturing capabilities, summarizes the current mood towards what he calls and we call deglobalization of the trade, but not only of the trade. Dr. Kuttner today had a political reading of this trend. I quote, he says, the multilateral system built after World War II laid the foundations for a mixed economy of broad prosperity, which in turn inoculated the body politic against neo-fascist tendencies of pre-war. The successor system, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, returned the economy to extreme insecurity and inequality, eventually stimulating a neo-fascist backlash. Similarly, yesterday, Dr. Jakubec pointed at the dilemma in a world where the surge of populism, driven by diverse socio-political factors, has reshaped both domestic politics as well as multipolarity. and setting thereby the stage for a shift away from the liberal democratic governance towards a multipolar populism. I would like to quote Jakubec here. He says, it's argued that people in the global north are losing faith in liberal and neoliberal governments and political parties. The voters in the global north are increasingly turning to national populism and governments in the global south. When in the global south, they perceive the geopolitical and geoeconomic global problems caused by the West. Yesterday, Dr. Nord has summarized the global trend in which 42 countries are now affected by the ongoing wave of autocratization. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is down to 1985 levels. Only less than 30% of people worldwide are now governed democratically, and autocratization often continues after democratic breakdowns, taking countries further into more harsh dictatorships. Well, we had a positive outlook by Dr. Wellens. His research provided some ray of hope, given their institutional strength and their immunity, he told us, immunity to crisis and windfalls. The advanced industrialized countries can withstand populism threat. Even a second Trump administration is exceedingly unlikely to asphyxiate democracy. That's Dr. Whelan's position, to which Dr. Azmanova observed, although she was not a speaker, but she was chairing, that particularly right-wing populist tendencies grow in ailing democracies, and thus their resilience need rather to be put into question. Regarding the taxonomy, Dr. Kuttner today was reminding us the conceptual and semantic mistake to conflate neo-fascism with populism. And I quote him, he says, the former has a clear meaning and clear historical antecedents, fascism, whereas the populism can refer to far-right authoritarian movements or to reformist pro-democratic left movements. I would like to finish with a final remark on the global governance chaos. It appears that the growing populism is pushing leaders of mid-sized powers to become more independent instead of relying on two hegemons. And I think the best example there is Erdogan of Turkey, who seems to be the quintessence of populist multipolarity. Ibrahim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Professor Akhtar. I think we have successfully came to the end of our 2 days symposium with valuable critical contributions from different disciplines of social sciences. Thank you all for those contributions, and I hope to see you somewhere by taking advantage of our next programs, maybe face-to-face or maybe virtual again. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, good day, good morning to everybody. Keep your health, please. Bye-bye. Thank you.